Welcome back. In this video lecture, number 3 in our series on the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900, we'll be discussing the rise of big business and then sales. So why don't we get started? So hopefully you will learn about these topics and you will see, I think, more clearly and maybe more concretely the impact of this great revolution that I call the capitalist revolution that took place during this time we call the Gilded Age. So here we go. Get ready to take some notes and please write down any questions you might have. Okay, so first up, railroads. Railroads first appeared in the United States in the late 1820s, and through the 1840s, they were very primitive, limited by technology, limited in scope. They were very local. That is, they didn't go very far. They didn't go very fast. They were expensive, and there were a lot of breakdowns. So people tended to rely on canals, barges, and/or stagecoaches, the traditional means of transportation that had been around for much longer in the United States. However, by the 1840s and into the 1850s, advances in technology made rail service locomotives more reliable, and there was a building boom that led to what you see here on the map, the U.S. railroad network by 1890, and you can see all the red lines indicate rail networks that really kind of cover the country, crisscross the country, especially in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. Far fewer lines in the South and then out to the West. But railroads by 1850 into the 1860s could travel at speeds up to 25 miles an hour. So in 2 hours, they could go 50 miles an hour. And on a good day, a stagecoach could cover 50 miles, but that was on a good day, and that was not that often. So railroads are going to rapidly increase speed and reduce costs in terms of moving goods and/or people around the nation. And what that does is, as you can see again, it connects the nation and is going to form a national market economy in which both farmers and merchants settle and work along the rail lines. And that's because they can get goods, they can move goods, sell goods, and they themselves can move about more freely. So the rise of the railroads in the 1850 to 1900 period really kind of coincides with, again, this great capitalist revolution. In addition, railroads also pioneered aspects of big business. Typically, businesses had been very small, family-owned concerns located in small towns and villages, and each family or each business kind of ran the operation on their own. There were no standard practices. But with the rise of big railroads, there needed to be some standardization, some way of conducting business across state lines, as you can see, and that is exactly what happened. So railroads led to the employment of thousands of people, so increased and incredible job opportunities. Revenues generated millions of dollars in revenue from their operations, and they also required millions of dollars for investment. It's not, after all, very cheap to build a rail network, as you can see, across large distances. The steel required, the locomotives, and then, of course, the people to run the railroad. And I think another thing that we might say is that the number of miles of railroad track, and as you can see, 193,000 by 1900, also becomes a way for a nation, such as the United States, to measure its status in the world of nations. And so by 1900, the United States rose to number 1 in the world in terms of miles of track. So we can see then a connection between the business, the size of business, and then the importance of that business to the overall national standing, if you will, in the world. And this is going to be an important thing, because at some point we're going to see that the United States, there develops a feeling of patriotism and connection, attachment to the United States. And the idea is going to be, as we discussed, bigger seems to be better in the United States, and we tend to like to occupy the number 1 position. Another thing that we can talk about is the idea that railroad companies also created the idea of stocks, that is, selling stocks, part ownership in the company, to shareholders, that is, people that had money to invest, typically bankers and wealthy, successful merchants, or great landowners, plantation owners in the South. And the idea of stock was that a person would buy a part share in a company in return for dividends, and dividends are profits. So the advent of railroads led to what we would call today the modern corporation. So this is going to be an important development in terms of the economic growth of the United States, having these corporations, having the ability for corporations to sell or issue stock to stockholders that's going to generate a flow of capital and business that we very much still see today in our society. All right. Okay, and there's, I think, one more thing to add with the railroads, and that is the idea of standardization. Um, Large corporations that operate across state lines and employ thousands and thousands of people need to have standard rules. And this was going to come about with the railroads. And one of the ways we see this really is the adoption of 4 time zones in the United States. In 1883, November of 1883, it was the railroads that actually pushed the United States government in Washington to embrace the idea of standard time, that is railroad time. So that's kind of confusing because we assume that time has always been standard, that there have always been time zones in the United States. That's not the case. Prior to 1883, time was very much a local affair. So there would be, for example, Radnor time, Bryn Mawr time, Berwyn, Paley time, etc. And that gets quite confusing when you're trying to run big trains at high speeds down tracks, and if nobody knows what time it is, the idea that there might be accidents and confusion as to when the train's coming or leaving, etc. So 1883, we went to what was called then railroad time, and the clock then replaced the sun as the way we measured time. So people then had to live and die by railroad time, as it was said at that time. So that's another advent. And railroad companies also developed accounting practices, price setting techniques, management techniques. We see the rise of middle class managers that would run the railroad for the people that owned it, that is the shareholders. And so we're going to see the rise of the middle class and managers who have to study techniques to be able to run these rather large companies. So I think railroads occupy a prime place in the development of the United States economy at this time in the Gilded Age. And 2 of the people, and I don't have them up here, 2 of the main railroads were the Pennsylvania Railroad, located right here in Pennsylvania, and the New York Central Railroad. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was the owner of the New York Central Railroad, and the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad competed. There were other railroads out west owned by Hill and Harriman. So these are some names that we might know, but not all that important. I think what's really important is what the railroads did to sort of unite and stitch the country together, the creation of national markets, and the idea of standardization, something that you all know because, as you know, in school, we live and die by the clock, right? The bell. The bell starts class and the bell ends class, and what happens in between is we're all sitting there, right, ostensibly paying attention and learning, but we're waiting for that bell to ring again to free us, and then we go to another class where we have the whole thing repeat itself. So I think that's all we can say about the railroads. So let's move on to the next topic, which is steel and Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie is there because he very much represents the steel industry in the United States in the 19th century. He's the guy that's responsible for the creation of large-scale steel mills. And you can see Carnegie's Homestead Steel Mill, which is located outside of Pittsburgh, Steel City, in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 1900s. Carnegie was the king of steel. Now, Carnegie, an interesting story. Oh, and it's also worth noting, I think, and I wrote this up above, that steel was to the 19th century as the computer microchip was to the 21st century. That is, steel really changed the way America looked, how people moved, the transportation revolution in terms of rails, the building of large buildings called skyscrapers, bridges that spanned large distances. So steel was really revolutionary and transformational, as the microchip was in the 20th century, especially the latter 20th century and into our own century. And that's, I think, worth thinking about. So Andrew Carnegie, he was a dirt poor Scottish immigrant, came to the United States in 1848 as a teenager, and he started working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he was really good at in the telegraph office. He had a very good memory and could send telegraphs that were very accurate, very speedy, etc. So he caught the attention of the higher ups, and eventually he was working with the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And Carnegie did quite well, and in fact the president would give Carnegie tips on what stocks to buy and sell. Carnegie did, and with the money he earned and saved, he bought stocks and became very wealthy at a very, very young age. And with that money, rather than spending it on things, he decided that he would get into the steel business that was kind of emerging, but very small scale, and he decided that he would open a plant in Pittsburgh, that he would invest in the latest technology, and that's the Bessemer steel converter, which is a process developed in Europe but then brought to the United States by Carnegie that allowed for the large-scale and efficient production of high-quality steel. And Carnegie then built this rather large plant and others across the country, and was able to continue to make steel. And you can see the production chart there down at the bottom, and you can see the amount of steel being produced from 1875 to 1900. It really goes up by sixfold, and Carnegie was at one point in control of over 25% of the United States market, and the United States quickly becomes one of the great steel producing nations in the world. Now, Carnegie, like the railroad men before, was also a shrewd businessman who pioneered business techniques. He used technology and believed in technology, invested in technology. He hired the best people and paid those people well. Yet he was also into cost cutting. And that typically involved cutting the wages of his workers in the mills, not the skilled workers, but the workers in the factories, in the mill hands, etc. So he would cut their wages in order to boost profits. He would also cut prices for his products to undersell rival firms. He would lose money by doing so in the short run, but because he was so big, he would outlast his rivals, and then he would be able to then gobble them up and drive them out of business. Carnegie also developed the idea, what economic historians today call vertical integration. That is, Carnegie felt that he would be best able to control the steel market if he owned all aspects of steel operations. So he bought mines for the ores, he bought railroads, he bought shipping, he owned every piece of the process of making steel, and that allowed him to exert a great deal of control over that. So by 1900, Carnegie Steel Works employed 20,000 people, produced 25% of the world's steel, and in 1900 he earned $40 million in profit, and he kept $25 million himself. And then a year later, in 1901, he actually sold his Carnegie Steel operations to J.P. Morgan, a big banker, for $492 million, a staggering sum, many, many billions over in today's dollars. And that made Carnegie the richest man in America. And then what's interesting about Carnegie, and we'll come back to this later, is what he did with all of his wealth once he amassed it. He began to, in fact, give away, donate his wealth to various charities, and in that we see kind of the Bill Gates approach. All right, moving on now to oil. That's our next, if I could get this to work. All right, oil, and here we see John Rockefeller. So it's kind of interesting, each of these big industries has a seminal entrepreneur, and oil was John Rockefeller, who at the age of 1863 at the age of 24, in 1863, opened his first oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio, at the time of an oil boom. And you can see an oil derrick there on the right, spouting up a geyser of oil, and that's what it looked like in the early days. And then they would tap that and capture that oil and pipe it into a refinery, which you see down below on the left. What Rockefeller decided was that it was the oil refining that interested him the most. So he would purchase oil from the different fields, bring it to Cleveland, and then refine it. And what they were doing at that time, before the internal combustion engine, was making it into kerosene for lamps. So we'll pick up with that in our next lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.